So in our last unit, we talked some about the robber barons and some of the elite members of, or the elite people during the Industrial Revolution. But now we're going to focus a little bit more on the masses, just the common people. Earlier we talked about immigrants and how they were coming into the United States in droves during this time period. They were looking for jobs, of course. They were oftentimes, unfortunately, on the poorer end of things. So what I want us to keep in mind during this particular lesson is the guiding question: what were the working conditions of children and women during the Industrial Revolution? So we have all of these new industries that are developing in the United States and in Europe. We have the steel plants, we have the textile mills, we have all of these new inventions that are coming to the forefront. So we had to have people to man those factories. So those industrial jobs were oftentimes filled by immigrants. Unfortunately, immigrants were oftentimes accustomed to a lower standard of living and were desperate for work. They just needed to make money to help their families out. So many immigrant families needed extra income. So unfortunately, with that extra income came the need for women and children to work. So specifically looking at this child labor first, in 1870, there were 750,000 children under the age of 15. So that's y'all's age, working in mines or factories. That number, that 750,000, does not include the children that were working on farms or with their family businesses. By 1911, so just a short period after 1870, we had more than 2 million American children under the age of 16 who are working in these factories. The factory conditions were very, very, very tough. It was a hard living to make. Many times these children were working 12 hours a day for at least 6 days a week. So that averages out to be about 72 hours. Sometimes it was even more than that. Now let's just compare that to what we have to deal with today. Today, you are in school for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. Of course, that doesn't include your vacations and summers. These people did not get vacation and summer breaks. The average American working adult works for 40 hours a week, Monday through Friday, so only 5 days a week. So these children were oftentimes working had double the hours that the average American working adult has today in horrible working conditions. So just to give you some examples of what those working conditions looked like and the types of jobs that these children had. This first one up here talks about glass factories. Glass factories oftentimes hired younger boys because they were smaller and they were quicker. The boys oftentimes had to travel far distances to get to their jobs, sometimes up to 20 miles. So if you can imagine walking 20 miles to work or even traveling 20 miles to work without having a car, it's a long trip. They had 8-hour shifts, which doesn't really seem so bad until you realize that they were running the entire time. They were running for 8 hours straight, back and forth between glass ovens. The average pay for an 8-hour shift was only 72 cents. Down here, garment factories. This was mostly young girls. And you'll see the same thing in the silk mills. And they used young girls because their fingers were smaller and they were more agile, so they could do more detail work. They had to work 84-hour work weeks at a wage of about 5 cents an hour. The silk mills, once again, young girls, 9 years old or younger, they had to clean or watch the bobbins, which is the spinning part of the silk wheels. 3 cents an hour to do that. They were required for 12-hour shifts. There was no rest. So they couldn't stop for lunch. They couldn't stop to have a snack. They were just required to stand there and look at the bobbins. Cannery. Children as young as 6, they had to clean and behead fish and shrimp, which of course were being canned for mass-produced food. They stood for 12-hour shifts in really open sheds. So if the weather was bad, they were right there in the weather elements. And they had to have their hands submerged into ice water for those 12-hour shifts. So women in the workplace, it's similar to the children in the workplace. Women, though, usually earned half of what their counterparts did, their male counterparts did. Oftentimes they worked as seamstresses or in those textile mills as weavers. That once again came down to women typically having smaller fingers and hands than men did. They often had double duty though. They worked at the factories during the day and then came home and had to do domestic duties, cleaning the house, things along those lines, and then take care of their children. Just like we talked about with the child labor, the working conditions were oftentimes unsanitary and not very safe. So one of the big concerns that society had with women working was this part right up here. A lot of people didn't feel like women should be in the workforce because that they should be raising their children. But when they had that financial need to work, of course they had to. So a lot of people questioned whether women should actually be able to work in these factories. They felt like that these women needed to stay home and raise their children. And a lot of times people refer to this time period as children being raised without their mothers, because they had both parents that were working all the times. And I know that many of you have parents that work 40 hours a week, but once again, these mothers were often working double that 40 hours a week, so they were rarely at home to raise their children. So one of the first sparks that helped to Americans and Europeans to realize that they needed to really reevaluate their labor policies was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory incident. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located in New York City. It was a high-rise building. On March 25th of 1911, a fire broke out in one of the lower levels of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. 146 immigrant women died. Some of them were as young as 15 years old. So what had happened was there weren't the fire precautions that there are now. So owners had locked all of the outside doors going out of the building because they felt like their workers were stealing things. So in order to prevent things from being stolen, they had locked all of the doors. When the firefighters came to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, their ladders did not reach to the upper parts of the building. They only went about halfway up that building. So these women really never had a chance. The hoses didn't reach, the ladders didn't reach. The fire department really just was not prepared for a fire of this magnitude. A lot of the women that were involved in that fire actually chose to jump to their death instead of being burned. So like I said at the beginning, this event really sparked the ideas that we needed to A, change our working conditions, and B, look at fire codes and have more fire safety. And a lot of the codes and regulations that you see today are a result of this fire or similar factory fires that occurred during this time period. So I want you to keep in mind those children that were working in their factories and the women that were working in factories for tomorrow's activity. We'll be looking at images of these women and children working in the factories and doing some analysis with that. So it's important that you have this information. Have a good one.